Hi class, welcome to a mini lecture on narrative identity. I love this topic. I did my master's thesis on identity development, and it's been a long time interest of mine. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, I organized a symposium to bring Dan McAdams, who is the creator of the idea of identity as a life story, down to Northern Illinois University to talk to us about his work. Poor guy got lost and wandered around, coming down from Chicago to DeKalb, Illinois for a couple of hours. It was terrible. I hope we treated him right by the time we got him settled in. His talk was absolutely fascinating, and I want to share some of that with you today. So McAdams, this is just a paragraph in your textbook, and I want to try to flesh this out a little bit for you. McAdams has this life story model or narrative identity model, and he says that your narrative identity is an internalized story that you tell about yourself. It's like your own personal myth, your own movie, your own book. And just like myths and movies and books, our narrative identity has a main character, heroes, villains, major events that determine the plot, challenges, highlights, surprises, and detours. And our narrative identity is a way that we understand ourselves and others. Think about it. When's the last time you got to know somebody new? What did you do? Did you give them a list of facts? No. You told stories, and they told you their stories, and that's how you got to know other people. So McAdams talks about how narrative identity is a developmental process. It develops over the lifespan. So in the first year, we talked about this before in the childhood material, that children develop theory of mind. They start to know that people are intentional, that mom has intentions and the child has intentions, and they may not be the same. Mom wants me to get into my car seat and I don't want to. They start to realize that other people have different points of view. Mom likes broccoli, but I don't. I like goldfish, but mom doesn't. So this starts to develop in that first year of life. And this is the seed from which identity develops. In the second year, you get the emergence of storytelling and the autobiographical self. They start to think of themselves as agents acting on the world. I remember my son, we were in, when he was little, I had stopped graduate school and was taking care of him. And my husband was in graduate school for philosophy. And I would take him to the park most days. And one of his favorite things to do when he was little was go to the park, find a stick, and start banging on the metal poles of the play structure. And he was noticing that where he banged on the poles made a difference in what sound it made. And he would start to sing along with the sounds that he heard. And his favorite song was bing, 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 bing. And so he would come home, we would come home from the park, and Mark would come home from school, and Ethan would tell a story to his dad about what he'd done that day. I go to park, I bang, bing, bing, and he would sing the bing, bing song. And that was the very beginnings of his narrative identity. It was a story that he frequently told about himself. Well, fast forward, he's a 15-year-old musical kid, teaching piano lessons, playing guitar, recording music. And it all started with Bing Bing in the park and telling those first little emergent autobiographical stories. We start writing the story for real in adolescence. This is an echo of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, that by the time we're adolescents, we start to actively work on who are we. The culture seems to demand at that point that you get a life, and adolescents and emerging adults begin to form their stories in earnest. Once narrative identity enters the developmental scene, it remains a project to be worked on for much of the rest of the life course. Now, the stories aren't perfect recordings of history. If you remember your general psychology class and the lessons on memory, you will remember that your memory is not a recording. We make Our memories are reconstructions. In the same way, our stories are not about ourselves, are not perfect recordings of history. We make narrative choices. We decide what to leave in, what to leave out, how to reframe something. We interpret events that happen to us in an effort to make sense of them. There are a few different themes that come out frequently in people's life stories that reflect these narrative choices. One common theme is the theme of redemption. McAdams has found that people tell redemptive stories about their lives, stories where there was bad, but then it became good. And that people who tell redemption stories tend to be people who contribute to society and to future generations. There are also contamination stories where a life went from good to bad. These people tend to be less generative, more depressed and anxious, and their stories tend to lack coherence. So here's an example of this. When we were living in Wisconsin and I had quit my PhD program to take care of our son and my husband was working, I became very ill. And I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I don't think I actually have that, but at the time that's what we believed. And it was terrible. I was unable to work, unable to volunteer, unable to take care of my children. My mom started taking care of my children. My newborn daughter responded to her better than she did to me because I was too sick to take care of her. Now that could be a contamination story if that's where the story ended, but obviously it didn't end there because here I am teaching you. I have very much a redemption story. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm in the mall and somebody says to me, "Hey, I've heard that people do a special diet for MS, no gluten, no dairy. And have you ever tried that?" And I said, no. And my doctor told me not to do anything weird with my diet. And this person said, "What do you have to lose?" And I thought to myself, I have nothing to lose. I've already lost it all. So I went home that night and Googled no gluten, no dairy autoimmune disease. And it turned out lots of people do that. So long story short, I found that there were a number of foods that were triggering my symptoms. Over about 6 months, I cut out all of those foods and got my life back. And I have been pretty much fine ever since. There are also stories. There are two other themes that I would like to share with you about McAdams' life story model, themes of agency and themes of intimacy and communion. Themes of agency are stories about self-mastery, status, victory, achievement, responsibility, power, and autonomy. Here's my little story about agency. In graduate school, the first year of graduate school, my cohort took a year of statistics. And by the time you get to graduate school, everybody's a good student. Everybody's accustomed to getting straight A's, maybe the occasional B. Learning comes pretty easy. So we went into stats class thinking that we would all be fine. Well, after the first exam, we were all crowded around a sheet of paper outside the classroom door looking at our grades, and we had all gotten C's and D's and F's. I think there may have been a couple of people got C's. Mostly it was D's and F's. I don't remember what I got. It was a D or an F. Guys, there were people in that hallway crying. We were devastated, and I was devastated. I didn't sit down and cry. I went home and I worked my butt off. I did every problem that was assigned, plus all of the other problems that were not assigned in the textbook. Over and over, I would do them. I went to every office hours. I went to every study group, even though I don't like study groups because I'm an introvert and like to work on my own. And when it came time for the final, we were given one problem and we had to do hand calculations. And I spent about a week working on this one problem. And I had about 25 pages of hand calculations that I handed in. And when I got that back and it said A, and the instructor wrote, "You really learned a lot," I thought that was the best feedback I'd ever gotten. There are few words that have meant more to me than that. And that's because I had failed and then I had used my autonomy to create a sense of self-mastery. There are also stories of intimacy and communion, stories of love, friendship, dialogue, caring for others, intimacy, and belongingness. These are stories where maybe we were lonely, isolated, and finally found the love that we had hoped for. There's stories about someone got sick and you spent 5 years caring for that person until they passed away. There's stories of feeling like you're part of a group and part of a family for the first time, even if it's just friends at college. Those are stories of intimacy and communion. So in McAdams's life story model, we're continually making edits to our stories. We're continually changing the meaning of our stories, and these have impacts on how we see ourselves and what our mental health is like. When people are asked to write about their life story, it is found that this is essentially a form of therapy and is as effective as antidepressants or psychotherapy in helping people to overcome hardship in their life, in helping to alleviate negative patterns of thought and negative emotions. So the last idea here is the idea of possible selves. So in McAdams's life story, we're creating a sense of ourselves across time as we tell the stories about ourselves and create an identity out of that. This relates to the idea of possible selves because as we are writing those stories, we're thinking about who we have been and we're also thinking about who we might be in the future. Possible selves are representations of future selves that are both hoped for and feared. And the possible selves will motivate our behaviors and motivate us to achieve or to avoid those selves. So you might have a possible self of that looks something like, you know, you're 30 years old and you're a nurse and you go to work and help people every day and then you come home to a loving family. Or you might have a feared self where you can't pass anatomy and physiology and so don't get that nursing degree, and who knows what negative things happen after that. I'll let you guys imagine that on your own. So I have given you an assignment in Blackboard, assignment number 2, to sit down, find a quiet place, really imagine your best possible self in the future. Imagine it in all of its detail, what it smells like, what it sounds like, what do you do, who's there, what does it look like, how do you feel, what do you think, and turn that into me. We are more optimistic about achieving hoped for selves when we're young than we are when we're older. Older adults perceive the self as pretty stable. As we get older, physical health becomes an important aspect of feared self for older adults. I'll be interested to read all of your best possible self narratives and see what you guys are thinking about. All right, thanks for watching. See you next time.